friends, and a very warm welcome to this session, which is towards building community resilience of the marginalized and vulnerable ecosystems of South Asia. South Asia, as you all would already know, is a huge and diverse region, which is regarded as one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of climate change, as stated in the IPCC. The majority of people in this region are largely dependent on agriculture and allied activities, making them extremely vulnerable to climate variability and extremes. And the vulnerability is further compounded by environmental degradation and also socioeconomic challenges. uh, Climate change, for this reason, therefore, is sort of going to constrain the sustainable development capacities and abilities of most of the South Asian countries, especially its marginalized majority, by aggravating pressures on natural resources and also their livelihoods. Now, despite a whole lot of discussion happening on ecosystem-based adaptation and community-based adaptation, which has largely remained, macro in nature, we feel that these approaches have not significantly and adequately been discussed at the level of the marginalized to help them adapt to climate change and towards, building long-term resilience. Today, we are very happy that we have with us four distinguished speakers and an authority on adaptation with us, who have been working on several interesting models and approaches on grassroots adaptation processes and mechanisms. And we are very happy to have our speakers with us. We hope that the deliberations from this discussion would help regional, national, and international discourses and adaptation efforts. Without much ado, may I now introduce the speakers to you. We have with us Siddharth D'Souza, who is the director of LAYA Green Ventures from India. And we have four South Asian speakers. We have with us Mr. Tungabhadra Rai, who is the national coordinator of Nepal Federation. We have with us Ranga Pallawala, who is from Janatakshan, Sri Lanka. And we also are very pleased to have with us Dr. Rahman, who is the executive director of the Center for Natural Resource Studies, Dhaka, Bangladesh. We are really happy to have with us Dr. Salimul Haq, who will actually be commenting after each of the questions that we have for the speakers. We have deliberately decided not to have presentations and to make it as interactive as possible. So what we've done is that we have put together a set of 3 questions, which each speaker would we would like them to reflect upon. And post every question, we would leave the floor open for discussion to take a few questions and clarifications. And then on, we have a commentator commenting on each of the questions. Can I have those questions? Okay, there's some problem. But then I just outlined the questions to you all, which is already there with our speakers. The guiding question. The first one is in relation to identifying the best practices on adaptation and lessons learned from their own engagement at the community level. So this is the first question that we have for the speakers. Do all the speakers, do they have the questions with them? Yeah? The second question is in relation to the adaptation policy that the speakers would like to see in the national adaptation policy of the country, drawing from their own experiential learning, critiques, as well as recommendations. And the third and the final question for the speakers is, what are the key asks that they would have from the UNFCCC on adaptation? So those are the 3 questions. We'll take them one by one, speaker by speaker, and have a commentator reflect on the questions after every speaker has dealt with the questions. So with that, may I now invite the speakers to share on particularly question one, which is in relation to the lessons learned from your experience and what are the best practices that you've identified working with the community in your own ecosystems. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Siddharth. I work with an organization called LAYA. We are basically based in Andhra Pradesh. Just small. Okay. Can you just read it? Tribal communities in remote Andhra Pradesh. India, as you know, is quite diverse. I mean, our ecosystems are all over. We have almost everything. We have arid, semi-arid, mountainous, mangroves, coastlines, deserts, salt deserts, and in terms of the types of forests that we have, also it's tropical, deciduous, alpine, mangroves, etc. So we have all kinds of sort of terrain to deal with, and in a way, my particular sort of our particular work is to do with the particular the semi-arid, deciduous kind of forest area. And here, what we have tried to do is to sort of look at the most remotest sort of regions, and we did a kind of a study there. We did what is called a vulnerability study, where we looked at how do you say certain sort of certain communities that are completely sort of cut off from mainstream. And there we sort of try to understand how has been their relationship with the forest, in terms of how has the forest sort of, how have they adapted to the various changes that have been happening over a 10-year period. And what we finally came up with was that that already existing practices within these communities in a way are better suited to sort of adapting to climate change. So we identified basically a number of seeds or different kinds of sort of drought tolerant, flood tolerant seeds that actually in a way we verified with the research stations and the regional research stations over there, and then they sort of helped us to sort of home in terms of reviving, because many of these traditional seed varieties over a period of time was sort of was changing, in the sense that they were moving to rice and other sort of crops which was otherwise millets. So we sort of got into that, and in a way started with these different seed banks. And the seed banks, the idea was to sort of bring these drought resistant, food tolerant seeds back, also in terms of looking at their existing agricultural practice, and in a way trying to add value to that by bringing in whatever existing science is over there, and sort of taking the traditional model and then putting our own little, at least the scientific research, so trying and bringing it together, and in a way trying to sort of see what kind of changes one can sort of make in terms of the productivity of land, in terms of increasing the yield and so on. Along with that, we also brought in a few technologies. I mean, these technologies, small technologies, basically focusing community-based, individual, home-based, which basically looked at trying to sort of bring electricity, clean drinking water, basic light, irrigation, anything, basically what a small village would need. And that in terms of in that context, bringing these amenities, the access to these amenities was the focus. And there we brought in as a pilot, one micro hydro. We brought in biosand filters, solar lanterns, hydrants, smokeless food stoves, and so on. So this has been some of the effort that we have tried to sort of bring into these places in a way to add value to people's life. This has been so far, let's say, our work in relating to helping communities adapt in whichever way possible to different sort of climate changing conditions. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Siddharth. Tunga, can we hear?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, my name is Tungarai, and I come from Nepal. I belong to Roy indigenous community of Nepal, and I work with the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Peoples Organization in Nepal. Um, so, okay. So, as my organization is an umbrella organization of all the indigenous peoples groups and organization of Nepal, we work with different indigenous communities in different part of the country. As Ajita asked me to bring a good practice in terms of climate change adaptation, I choose one of the indigenous community called LAYA in the northern part of the country, which borders with Tibet, and it's the beyond. I mean, it's beyond the Himalayas, so it's a high altitude desert area. So the environment and the climatic condition, you can imagine how harsh it is to adapt in such a high altitude desert and to cope with the changing climatic condition in the area. Um, One very interesting thing we found while working with them is you can see in the picture it's a very dry and very arid, but also they have a lot of agriculture production around the town, little town there. That is possible only through the small farmer managed irrigation system up in the mountain, and that small irrigation system management each backed up by the indigenous institution and indigenous village chiefdom system that sets the governance of that irrigation system, and also that very much links with the indigenous knowledge of indigenous people of the area. So I came up with the conclusion indigenous knowledge as a key to climate change resilience. Um, so this is one of a good practices. You can see in the photo how they come together and how they set the rules and regulations in order to adapt in such a harsh climatic condition. And then, you know, the village chiefdom system plays a key role here, and they make every decision, and they make uh, themselves able to cope with such a climatic condition. And then they have a saying here that they say nothing is possible without irrigation. Melting of heavy snowfall of the winter makes land and canals very fragile, which requires mindful act of all of us to continue our livelihood, survival, our culture, including our village chiefdom system, which is a part and parcel of our livelihood. So this system has rules and regulations in terms of operation, maintenance, distribution, allocation, conflict management, and everything. So point here I'm trying to make is how the indigenous knowledge and indigenous way of coping with changing climatic condition can be taken together along with the climate change resilience actions or climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very important. The process of resilience building at the community level. Yes, Ranga.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. My name is Ranga Pallavala. I'm from Sri Lanka. I don't have a presentation, but a few points to mention as the best practices that we can get from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a comparatively a very small country if you compare with India, for example. It's 65,000 square kilometer country with a population of 20 million, so it's a congested population. But even though we are a small country, we have three main agroclimatic zone, and which divided into about 36 sub-agroclimatic zone. That means you have 36 different kind of agroclimatic zone that you can find in Sri Lanka. So that itself describes the diversity within the country. Uh, in terms of climate change, being a small country, we are struggling to local level adaptation with the national level adaptation, because the local level voices have been taken into our national adaptation planning process. But of course, we should have a kind of an overarching adaptation the practice which goes beyond the administrative boundaries to make sure that we don't create conflicts between the agroclimatic zones, agroecological zones, and the administrative boundaries. But one of the best practices I want to highlight here is the participation of people in developing local level cultivation seasons in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, especially in the dry zone and the intermediate zone, the paddy cultivation is the main livelihood of people. And because of the climate change, the water availability for paddy cultivation has changed, especially the rain-fed agriculture people, and the small what do you call the tank irrigation systems. And one of the best practice we can take from Sri Lanka is how the farmers coming get together and do kind of a seasonal forecasting prior to the season, and based on the water availability, they decides on the variety that they are going to cultivate and the cultivation season and the timing of the entire season. That helped a lot for them to adapt, but of course there are certain limitations in adaptation, as we all know. The participatory approach in making cultivation plans, it's a good practice from Sri Lanka, we can mention. At the same time, it's very important to get the indigenous knowledge, the local farmers' knowledge, because they have the high capacity of using the environmental, the facts and figures in a very rational format and convert into a very usable knowledge for the farmers. In Sri Lanka, because of its the location, it's an island in the southern tip of India. And if you look at the southern part of Sri Lanka, until the southern pole, we don't have any landmass. So we are a poor country in terms of getting correct climate data. And in the very state-to-art, the climate modeling figures was able to develop seasonal forecasting with the accuracy of 60%. And the recent studies I've done with the traditional knowledge, some farmers in the north central province and in the southern province, looking at the environmental facts and figures, they can predict the seasonal. We give a seasonal forecast with the 85% accuracy. So you can compare. These are statistically proven stuff. So the indigenous knowledge, I think it's a key for country in the community-based adaptation. So I'll stop there. Probably we can discuss later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ranga. Thanks for those reflections. Dr. Rahman.
Thank you, Ajita. I'll be talking about some of our adaptation initiatives in one of the what we used to say climate disaster hotspots in Bangladesh. We have several locations. I mean, see coastal areas, drought-prone areas, and also flood-prone areas, and the Howard area, which is the low-lying basin located at the foothills of Meghalaya hills in India. It's very, the hills and then low-lying floodplains. And that's why the area is prone to both seasonal flooding, regular flooding, and also the early flash floods. And because of this inundation pattern, 6-7 months, the whole area remains underwater. And in monsoon time, the villages are like, the islands. So the farmers can grow only one crop in a year, as opposed to 2-3 crops in other parts of the country. And this both flash flood and seasonal flood are historical. People have some sort of, a kind of adaptation to this previously. But the problem happens now is we analyze the rainfall data of Meghalayan areas in India over the last 100 years, and have found that there is increase in rainfalls in late March to early April, which is from 150 millimeter to 250 millimeters. It indicates that the flash flood, the two things. One is flash flood is obvious almost every year, and the timing of flash flood is taken forward, is coming forward. So it's hitting end of March or early April. But the rice they grow, they usually transplant in January and then harvest in April. So just before harvesting, there is a hit by the flash floods. And the major reason is this rainfall variability, timing, etc. The other thing is that we also communicated with the Indian states university teachers and paid a visit there, and we saw that there is also kind of deforestation in the hill slopes that speed up the flash flood. And the other thing is that due to this flash flood carrying in lots of gravels and sands, so the carrying capacity of rivers and wetland system is reduced. So the water, overtops the river banks and it hits the cropland. So what we try to do is that, in fact, try to use the fast growing rice crop. I mean, the conventional crop variety is called BR29, which gives the highest yield, 6.5 tons per hectare, but it takes 165 days. Farmers love to do that because they like to take the risk, and then if it is harvested, they get more yield. But there are other varieties, what we call the short duration variety invented by the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute. In 145 days, you can harvest, but its yield is 5.8 tons. So it's a little bit less than that variety. But, so we tested that variety is one thing. The other aspect is that there are 20% land in that low-lying Howard Basin. We call it Howard, it's like inland sea basin. There are many raised lands along the wetlands and river systems. And these raised lands are remaining fallow because it is owned by the government, and irrigation is difficult there. And also for long-term remaining fallow, it is very hard to plow the land. So we actually tried farm, but this area, this raised land is less susceptible. I mean, the water comes late and also receded early. So the opportunity for farming is there. But there is lack of technology and lack of kind of initiatives. So we actually handle two aspects. In the conventional lands, short duration rice varieties, and in these raised lands, alternative crops, including rice varieties. The area is actually, the farmers, they're accustomed to rice production system, not other vegetables or the spice crops or pulse crops, other things, and even wheat. So we actually introduced along with the scientists of Bangladesh Agriculture Research Institute and Rice Research Institute, we demonstrated in these lands, we provided the farmers with tractors and irrigation systems. They use 2-3 steps irrigation with a kind of flexible water pipe from river to a small pond and then to cropland in the Kanda land. And what we have observed that the BR45, which can be harvested 3 weeks earlier than the conventional high-yielding one, can better avoid the flash flood risk. And the Kanda farming thing is more profitable because these are cash crops, and they can harvest far earlier than the timing of flash flood visits, and they can also do double cropping. So this is the way the farming communities, particularly the smallholder farmers, we actually engage the landless people in this cash land. And the other aspect that we have is the capacity building, particularly train the farmers on alternative crop variety farming systems, also link them with the input retailers so that they get all these quality seeds and etc. And the other thing is we also handed over through negotiating with the government, we have the policy to distribute state-owned land or the government land to the landless farmers. So we actually, during the project of 2 years, we handed over land, but 1 acre of land per person per household to 101 poor families. And after the project finished last year, the community themselves negotiated and got another 125 farmers got the cash lands or the government lands. So the practice actually helped communities to adopt a kind of resilient farming system and can avoid the flash flood risk. But we also think that, parallel to this adaptive farming system, water management and land management, and meaning the submersible dike construction and maintenance on time is important, because we need actually different measures, multiple measures to address this problem. So this is what at the farmers level that it worked and helped the smallholder farmers to adopt this sort of farming system using the karstlands. So that's so far the results that we have got. The initiative was funded by the UK Aid under a project. So I stop now here and then preparing myself for the question, to answer the question 2 and 3. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Rahman. I think those are very interesting insights coming across from three ecosystems: the forest, the coastal, and the Himalayan. And the points that were touched upon in relation to sustainable farming practices, as we heard from Siddharth. And there was this crucial element of governance that came across in Tunga's presentation, also Ranga's presentation, and Dr. Rahman's presentation. And this becomes very interesting to see and understand that for me particularly, when I'm trying to look at this governance system, one is trying to understand, well, communities are doing it on their own, but I mean, how far can they go? What are the other kinds of partnerships that are required to sort of strengthen this sort of a process, which is kind of, which adds to the resilience of local communities. I'd like to hear Dr. Huck's response on the question that I have, and also his generic, comments and reflections on all that he's heard from the speakers. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ajita, and thank you to all the speakers for some very, very interesting and illuminating examples from the 4 countries. Let me make 3 points. Firstly, in the UNFCCC process, which is where we are right now in COP22, we tend to talk about these things in very global terms, and it's about globally directed and globally agreed national adaptation programs of action, and then national adaptation plans and NDCs, and so on and so forth, many, many different acronyms. And these are sort of given to countries to develop and report back to the UNFCCC. We are trying to improve the connection with what happens on the ground, but in my view, we don't do that. We find it in the side events like this, some connection to what's happening on the ground. But in the negotiations themselves, not a lot. And what I get from the presentations that we just saw or heard is that a lot is happening on the ground. And there are several lessons from what I've just heard and from my own experience. The first one is that people living in vulnerable communities, we have examples here from South Asia, but it's true for other countries as well, already are experiencing climate change. Changes shifting in the patterns of the rainfall, shifting in what is happening, the way they've seen it from the past. So climate change is a reality on the ground. Secondly, in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, the communities with assistance from others are not sitting idle. They're doing something about it. They're trying to do something about it. They're adapting as best they can, either with the indigenous knowledge that they have or with indigenous knowledge married to scientific knowledge that comes in from scientists and NGOs and others. So a lot of things are beginning to happen on the ground. So let me finally share my experience of trying to bring this bottom-up experience from the ground and connect it to both the national level within countries and also the global level, particularly here in the UNFCCC. And I've been doing over the many last year, over 10 years now, an annual international conference on community-based adaptation, where we bring together hundreds of people working at the community level. Last year or this year, we held it in Bangladesh. The year before that, it was in Kenya. Year before that, it was in Nepal. Next year in June of 2017, we hope to hold it in Kampala in Uganda. And what we do is we bring together several hundred people who are working on the issues, some of them practitioners, some of them researchers, some of them funders, a mix of people. They come for 7 days. For the first 3 days, we take them out in groups of 20. They go and stay for 2 nights with a vulnerable community, seeing what their problems are and seeing how they're trying to tackle their problems. And then they come back to the capital, and we have another 4 days of conferences like this, sharing and learning from each other. And this is now a very, very fast growing community of practice, numbering in the many thousands around the world, not just in developing countries, not just in South Asia, even in developed countries. Now there are grassroots level community-based actions because there are vulnerable communities even in rich countries, and we are reaching out to them and bringing them together. And so we are hoping actually to, after next year's conference in Uganda, maybe have the one after that in 2018 in Colombo, organized by Ranga. He just organized a major, with the government of Sri Lanka, obviously, a major Asia Pacific adaptation forum just a few weeks ago in Colombo, where there were over 1,000 people, again, a mix of government, non-government, private sector, sharing experiences. So there's a lot happening already on the ground, and we need to make sure that they are laterally shared amongst each other within countries and across countries, and brought up to the global level in fora like this, so that we can inform the decisions that are going to be made here in Marrakesh and beyond. The final point I'll make on the adaptation side in the Marrakesh Agreement is we have now an adaptation goal in the Paris Agreement. We really don't understand what that means, but we put it in there because we think it's a good thing to have. And I think one of the things we want from our grassroots level practitioners is to contribute to the thinking around how do we aggregate up from the bottom up to something that we can call a global adaptation goal. And that's something that is an intellectual challenge, but it's also a practical challenge. And in my view, this should be a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huck, for sort of linking the micro to the macro picture. With that, because Dr. Huck is with us for the next half an hour, he's here with us until 5:45. We'll take on the next two questions so that we can have his reflections after the speakers put up their thoughts, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. The next question to the speakers is in relation to the adaptation policy that they would like to see in their own countries. We know for many of them the process is underway. I know for India that we are still in the process of developing our national adaptation plans. For others, it's already in place. But given our experience in India and elsewhere, we also seem to understand that there is a huge disconnect between practice and policy. And therefore, the second question is in relation to the policy bit of it, as to what would you like to see in the adaptation policy of your country. I'd request the speakers to reflect on the current situation, their experiential understanding, and have recommendations. Should we say we give you 5 minutes each? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, for India, I think, the focus seems to be on increasing forest cover. In fact, we have claimed that our forest cover over the years has actually increased. But the trouble with that is it depends on how you define forest. That's where things get a little wishy-washy, I think. And in a way, at least in the area that I work, a lot of the forests have been, in fact, taken away or cut down by the forest officials themselves. And in a way, it's and been replaced with timber plantation. And what that does is that obviously it denies communities living over there with access to non-timber forest produce, which has been in a way one of their additional incomes that has always traditionally been there. So for us, this is obviously a serious problem. And in a way, we think that, forest by itself needs to be more in terms of, respecting its biodiversity. So therefore, monoplantations and just forest for the sake of forest, in a way has no meaning. So I suppose that would be one definite ask. The other is in terms of the technologies that I was talking about earlier. I think household-based technologies, community-based technologies are something that I think governments probably around the world seem to sort of not focus on too much. Always it seems to be about large projects, mega projects, big dams and things like that. where the resources are sort of centralized, instead of sort of giving access to communities from a decentralized sort of system. So also in terms of the decision making that happens, it's sort of from people decide in Delhi and then sort of work their way around down. Whereas we would like to see the communities themselves within their own governance structures working together and bringing up what would be more pertinent for their area in that sense. So where in our case panchayats would sort of work towards deciding for themselves and then presenting it to the next year and then so forth and so on and so forth till it reaches Delhi. This I think is what we would sort of expect from a policy perspective. Yeah.
Nitunga.
Okay, thank you. The second question, what is our call for our government in terms of adaptation policies and programs? First of all, also let me share you, because forest is always considered as one of the good areas where we can harness our efforts for adaptation or whatever climate change actions. So the forest cover of Nepal is 40% of the total land, and as I'm coming from indigenous community, the population of indigenous community in Nepal is 38% of the total population. So given this context, let me go to the adaptation plans and programs of Nepal. Nepal has developed national adaptation plan of action, local adaptation plan of action, and also even community-based adaptation plan of actions. Those are all the policies. And also now, being as one of the least developed countries, Nepal is also developing national plan of actions. And now our call as indigenous peoples would be to the government to call for build on adaptation actions from the community experiences and knowledge and context that I have already presented, because it has been there for centuries and centuries, no matter whether we call it adaptation or whatever the jargon we give it to it, that communities have been doing it for generation and generation. So this is our first call. And secondly, we also urge our government to implement Paris Agreement. When it comes to indigenous peoples community, then we refer back to the preamble of the agreement, where there has been the reference to the rights of indigenous peoples. And if we get into more specific to the adaptation, then Article 7, paragraph 5 mentions knowledge of indigenous peoples in the adaptation. So we remind them to implement that. And further on to the Article 8 of the agreement, and in the paragraph 4, there is the mention about resilience of the communities and livelihood and ecosystem. And further down in the Article 15, it has mentioned the compliance with the provision of Paris Agreement. So every party has to comply with each and every article and elements of the Paris Agreement. So now we have a lot of alarms to our government around nationally determined contribution, because most of the nationally determined contribution has already alarmed us with a huge impact on indigenous communities. We have a really huge suspect on INDCs, but now NDCs be a false solution of climate change action, because you see the big hydro dams and energies which are considered as 100% clean energy. But on the other side, if you see the other greenhouse gas emission from these kind of energies, it has huge impact on one side, and on the other side, the displacement of the indigenous peoples and other communities, and also so many others impact of such a so-called 100% clean energies. So these are our calls, and especially we call our government, our country, to comply with their commitment on United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention number 169, and also the CBD Article 8 point J, which explains about the indigenous knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunga, for emphasizing the importance of indigenous voices in macro policy choices. And I think that's something that is missing across the negotiations, where the voices of the marginalized is somehow brushed aside, and the focus is on large, and macro scenario and big jargons. I think with that, I would request Ranga to share your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Ajita. Salim, a few minutes back, mentioned the daunting task of defining the global adaptation goal. Of course, it's going to be very difficult, because I think as a countries also we are facing a struggle of defining country adaptation goals as well. I think the main reason is the diversity that we have been discussing. South Asia as a region, and even in each and every country in South Asia, and many of the countries in globally also have its own diversities, and defining adaptation is becoming very difficult, because adaptation is directly in relation with the socio-cultural and economic aspects of people. In Sri Lanka, uh, one of the asks we have put when the adaptation policy is being drafted is that uh, we should not delink the adaptation with the sustainable development actions. If you want to build the adaptive capacities of the people, especially the vulnerable and the marginalized groups, we need to consider about the assets, the financial assets, the human asset, the physical, natural, and social assets. Because if these assets are being built and strengthened, only the people can face the challenges or the external shocks that they're facing, including the climate change. So sustainable development has a very close relationship with adaptation. So the link between adaptation, climate change, and sustainable development should not be forget, which includes all the other things. Of course, Tunga mentioned about the CBD Convention on Biological Diversity, and the so many other conventions that we are talking in relationship to environmental sustainability. On the other aspect, one of the other thing we need to consider about this governance issue. This is very important to enhance the adaptive capacities or improving the social and human assets of vulnerable communities, so they can successfully face these climate change challenges. So the governance can be enhanced to make sure not only having a national level governance or a climate change governance, which is just reporting back to UNFCCC at the global level, but how to create a sustainable link with the subnational level governance, how the governance can reach to the local level. So this is very important. For example, countries like in most of the countries in South Asia facing this challenge. For example, in Sri Lanka, environment is a devolved subject in our constitution. So some of the responsibilities lies with the central government, where some of the responsibilities lies with the subnational government. So when it comes to implementation of these policies, then always there's a struggle, and there are gray areas where we are spending a lot of time, resources, and energy to find out whose responsibility is that. Another good example comes from Pakistan, when they have their new constitution, where the climate change has become a devolved subject. So how to tackle with it? So I think clarity in subnational level governance of implementation, adaptation, and sustainable development is a crucial thing, which need to be a part and parcel of overall adaptation policy. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ranga, for bringing forth that very important point on capacity building, not only at the national level, but state level and sub-national level governance systems. We have seen in the case of India, where we have the state action plan on climate change. We have action plans made for around 30, 31 states. But when you try to see and understand how these action plans are translated into the annual plans of the state, you hardly find it synchronizing. You hardly find a translation of the state action plan happening into going into the annual plans. And that is where the problem lies, that how do you implement it? The policy is in place, the action plan is in place, but then there's little clue on how to go about it, and that is a very big challenge. However, we find a lot of value again at the level of the grassroots, working with local governance systems. In India, we have something called the panchayats, the local level government, where we work with elected representatives. And to us who are working, I talk for myself, working in an organization that works with indigenous communities, and we have found that partnerships where the communities are capacitated go a long way in building local level adaptation and in a way contribute to fostering sustainable development. So that's a very, very important point. But yes, we need to figure out how to go about and how do we go about building capacities at various levels with a variety of stakeholders. Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Rahman, can I request you to share your insights with us, please?
Okay, thank you. Like other LDCs, we also have this NAPA. Then we also had one national document, policy document called Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, and the NAP is now under preparations. But based on our experience in adaptive farming in climate affected areas of the Howard Basin in the Northeast, just like to say that there are several points I'd like to highlight. One is we have the government law or rule for handing over the cultivable government-owned land to the landless people. But the process is so cumbersome, time-taking, and clumsy. What we have concluded that experience based on the experience of working with this on this issue, it's really impossible for a landless farmer to access cash land following the current system. So there's a need for, at the national level, need for simplify the process so that they can get it. Because of this complex system, actually other people get access. Those who are smart at the local level, they can better navigate in the process, and in the name of landless, they can have the access to it. So this is kind of need some changes. And the other thing is the national food policy actually support grow more food rather than technology for resilient food production system. So there is a need for making some changes here, because a generic policy for grow more food is not really workable if we consider our different climate affected areas like coastal zones and drought prone areas and flash flood prone areas. The other things related to policy is the regular operation and maintenance systems of embankments, where usually the water development board, they do it by themselves. There is demand from the communities that since it will protect our crops, so the community should be engaged in it so that we can better suggest, technically advise them how to fix it. So, but the system, we advocated, and in some places it is on, but we need to mainstream this. The other thing, as I said, that 20% of the land available in the 7 districts of this low-lying basin is kind of, the Kandal and remaining fallow state land, but these are being grabbed by the local influentials. So there is a need for, a kind of identifying, mapping, and protecting these lands and try to allocate this land to the landless people. And of course, the technical support is important, particularly on resilient farming systems, understanding climate variability and change issues, and what should be their actions on the ground. The other thing is that we have very good early warning system for the coastal areas to safeguard against these cyclones, but we don't have a workable early warning system for the Howard areas due to flash flood issues. So that's where actually we need to we ask the government to come up with this, and in doing so, actually what we need is transboundary cooperation. We need on-time rainfall data from India, but some of our policies clearly said that, well, we need to have transboundary cooperation on some aspects, but it is not in the action but in the policy. So we think that this is very important. The other thing is, the agriculture. I mean, as I said, that most of the policies are good in reading, but for agriculture thing, actually, we need water, land, energy, DRR, local government, fisheries, all these policies should be coherent so that they are not colliding, rather supporting, supplementing, and should not be siloed in terms of the implementation of actions. So there is, huge inter-policy gap, not really supporting adaptation, because we think that the adaptation in agriculture should be based on the principles of ecosystems approach. And within this ecosystem approach, there could be nested community-based adaptations, because within one system, there are lots of variations, upstream, downstream, and this and that. We have 710 kilometers of coastal zone, but there are 5 different types of systems there because of the salinity gradients, the cyclone problems, and other things. So we need a kind of, coherent policies, and this sort of kanda farming or resilient farming systems need to be mainstreamed. What is proved good in the workable good at the grassroots should be mainstream. So policy should address this and adopt this in future NAPs. So that's what that I'd like to talk about, the national level aspects. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Rahman. I think the concern you have raised in relation to data access and sharing is very crucial for an effective climate response. When we work with the communities, we have been having a whole lot of challenges while doing vulnerability studies because we don't have local level rainfall data. Very location specific rainfall data. We don't have location specific land and soil data. We have been having tremendous challenges while we are trying to understand and explore something, develop a tool to sort of measure what is the impact from the work, the initiatives that we have taken at the community level, which has, gone into building adaptation. And lack of data comes across as a very big handicap. And that is crucial to sort of, building a database, especially at the local level, because adaptation is very, very local in character. And data sharing access, transboundary access, as was mentioned by Dr. Rahman, would be really helpful and would be a game changer, so to speak, to address climate responses. Yes, Dr. Huck, please.
Thank you very much, Ajita, and thank you to the speakers again for some very interesting comments. I'll make 2 broad comments. The first one is to admit the problem here. The problem is a governance problem at national level and a governance problem at the regional level as well. At the national level, every country has its own political situation where, in general, I would say it is very true to say for any country that the poor and vulnerable people of a country are in part poor and vulnerable because they don't have voice in their own governance system. And if they happen to be indigenous, that's even more true for them. And so part of what we need to be thinking about is how do we improve that situation? How do we give them better voice? Collective action is one way, getting good evidence is another way. In the global negotiations, for example, working with the least developed countries and vulnerable groups, that is our strategy, is to enable them to have collective voice, to have science-based voices, and to be able to persuade other countries who are much more powerful and the ones that are polluting and causing the problem to actually abide by agreements and agree to reduce pollution. There's a similar dynamic at the national level, and each country is very different. The space for argument and discussion is different in each country. We have to do what we can there. The other point I'd make is, in these circumstances, what is the role that NGOs and research organizations at the national level can play? I think they can play both a national as well as a international or regional scale problem. The one that Ajita and Mokles mentioned about data sharing, information sharing, at least at the national, at the local level of the communities, indigenous communities, other local communities, NGOs, academics, researchers, there is really no constraint. We can talk to each other. We have the ability to develop common programs, share knowledge. In fact, in the context of climate change in South Asia, the Climate Action Network South Asia is one of the most, I would say, one of the most active regional nodes of Climate Action Network International, and across the different national CAN nodes and networks, we have excellent relationships with each other, and we collaborate and work together. I think that's the way to go. Unfortunately, our governments are not necessarily always that collaborative, so we have to push from the bottom up to make them respond. Hopefully they will respond if they have some semblance of democratic credibility or accountability. Then they need to be accountable to the people, and we need to make them accountable to the people. But it's an uphill struggle. We must admit it's not easy to do. Having said that, I'd like to thank Ajita and the speakers for inviting me, and apologize very sincerely for having to run off to another appointment, if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Haq. Dr. Haq, before you leave, maybe one last comment.
Sure.
What is your expectation on the adaptation pillar and the global goal of adaptation that you sort of referred to? How do you see it evolving, if at all?
So let me share something that my institute, along with a number of others, are in the process of developing. And we are planning to do an exercise in India with Terry on this. So we're going to do Bangladesh, India, and Philippines, and South Africa. And as I mentioned earlier, look at the experience of bottom-up adaptation practice, learning, what kind of indicators and metrics we might be able to think about using, and see whether any of these would be aggregatable across scales, but from the bottom up. And the whole purpose of developing such metrics, in my view, this is my opinion, has to be primarily, I would say 90%, for the benefit of the people themselves, to measure their own progress. The question that we need to answer is not so much, who's doing more adaptation and who's doing less, but how am I improving my adaptation? Me, myself, my community, my household, my city, my locality. And so we have some measures, so we can measure progress over time for the people doing the adaptation. They're the first client. Then the second client is the global community. Can we aggregate these measurements across the country, across different countries, across regions? Can we see whether we are going towards a global goal or not? So aggregating across and up to the global is an interesting, as I said, theoretical question. But to me, it's the second order question. The first order question is, how do we design something that is useful to the people to do themselves? And therefore, they will do it themselves. They'll do it because it's useful to them, not because some global agreement requires them to collect all this data and provide it. So that's my preliminary thinking. We're going to actually do a side event on this next week, and we'll share a little bit of our preliminary thinking, and then, as I said, a number of pilots, and we'll do them in an open participatory manner. So we'll share progress as we go along over the next year or so, and see if we can come up with some sort of indicators and measurements that make sense for the people doing the adaptation primarily, and also can be used for the global community, for the global goal discussions as well.
Thank you, Dr. Haq. Thank you for those extra 2 minutes.
Thank you.
With that, can we open the floor for discussion before we go into the third question, which is largely macro in nature? The third question for the speakers is in relation to the key asks from the UNFCCC on adaptation. And while that's macro, and the purpose of this side event is to trust the community position, to trust the community voice in adaptation decision-making and adaptation processes. So before we go into the larger macro question, can we have a few questions from the floor? Yes. Myron, help us. Could you please identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Paula Pebsworth, and I'm representing the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I'm representing people of faith, and we are hoping to help Indigenous people find their voice. So from a grassroots level, can you give me some advice that I can give my people? How can we help you? How can we help you find your voice? Are there things that we should be doing or should not be doing to help Indigenous people worldwide?
Could you also tell us who do you want this question to be directed? Should we collect the questions? Maybe 3 of them, and then, yes.
Okay, good evening. My name is David Michael. I'm with Citizens Climate Lobby. This may not sound like a question, but just like she said, helping the local communities to understand that the resources around them belong to them, empowering them and building a system of community governance helps. I'll give you one example shortly. In Nigeria, there's a community called a Kuri community. They have a forest, and for over 30 years, they never allowed anyone go into the forest, including the members of the community. And now they are benefiting from the UN Red Plus project. The government wants to construct a road and pass through that forest, means the forest they've been protecting will be destroyed. And they rose up with a voice, and with civil societies, they were able to stop this project from going on. So I think that empowering the communities to understand that the resources within them belong to them, it helps. So they protect, they know, you empower them as well to understand that climate change affects even what belongs to them, which is those resources. So in that way, they are quick into adaptation and all. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jessica de Torbercilia. I come from Christian Aid and at the same time ACT Alliance. I have a question for anyone in the panel who can respond to this. But how do we think our approaches in adaptation in sync with the evolving definition of adaptation and resilience developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? The reason why I'm raising this is that I've listened to the examples that you're giving, and I wonder whether the approaches that have been shared allow our communities to cope and yet not adapt. So there's a big difference between allowing them to cope now with the hazards that we face, but given the challenges of the future that are far more, that may be beyond our expectations and even our capacity to adapt, how are we preparing them? I mean, that's just my question. Thank you.
Ranga, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenge we have is coming up with definition, or not actually coming up with definition, give that understanding of the real meaning of adaptation. It's not as you mentioned, not to face the current status, but the predicted and the projected challenges in the future. This is very important, and this is where I think most of the organizations have failed as well. And I believe some of the governments also have failed in that sense, because they're talking about managing the status quo, not the projected incremental the adaptation challenges. This is one way it is challenging as well, because the prediction, the future challenges is very, very vague. As I mentioned, for a country like Sri Lanka, where the models fail to give 65% of accuracy, it's very difficult for us to predict, okay, what's the scenario. But if we plan for the worst case scenario, then this whole lot of discussion of loss and damage come into the play. Because what we have seen increasingly in the countries, especially in South Asia, is like adaptations has limits, and unfortunately most of the vulnerable communities or the marginalized communities have reached to the threshold of adaptation, and now they are facing the losses and damages. So of course these two needs to go hand in hand, and that's what the whole discussion is going on, and come up with instruments, tools and mechanisms to handle this is going to be very, very challenging. But for that, of course, what we need to have is kind of a debates and dialogues, and keep this dialogue move on, and so we can have a kind of a clear understanding and come up with approaches. And it's a never-ending process. It's a rolling ball. That's my response.
Yes, Dr. Rahman. Yeah.
Well, I mean, all these are very good questions. I think what Michael said talked about the community governance and the ownership of resources by the communities. Well, maybe in some settings, this sort of thing is still on and it's possible. But like if you consider our forests, national forests, it was actually under the community management. So the communities were empowered to take decisions in forest management in the past. But there is a shift, from kind of community management system to state management system. So by this way, in the name of more improvement and protection and all these things, we actually disempowered the local communities. But at the same time, also we experienced, I think the experience across the country is that after this disengagement or disempowering the communities, I mean, we actually failed to improve, maintain, and sustain the forests. And later, now we have a kind of co-management system. So from community to state to co-management, so state and local communities managing together. Through this kind of re-empowering the communities is now taking place. But still, I mean, as you said, that the status quo thing is from the government part, engaging and giving ownership to the communities on taking decisions is really not very going effectively, or the responses from the relevant state agency actors is very slow and not encouraging. So this is what that I just can say in our context. And I think the local communities' voice, what I understand that, making alliance with and networking with different organizations working for raising the community voices could help better bring the community's voice to the different policy spaces, could help. So actually, the better that the NGOs working on with the communities, indigenous communities, should work together and make alliance within themselves first, and then take actions for raising the local voices to the national and international levels. Could help. And the third question is very important. That, well, what actually we do is, like as I said in my presentation, that the resilient farming systems at this, flash flood prone areas in low-lying basin improved, giving us good results. Communities are benefited, land productivity increased, and the varieties they use and the technology they use, the location they use, have potential to avoid the early flash flood timing. But is this enough? So that's why I said that policy coherence, because if you want to build the resilience, we need to take into account other related issues. That's why we try to engage the health department to provide, health supports, and how the flash flood prone areas, also the education system is very bad during the monsoon when the villages are isolated due to flooding. I mean, the schooling system actually collapse at that time. So some alternative mechanism is needed. And also the social protection system. We have lots of government social protection system, but often that this support system is not reaching the right person, the right vulnerable groups. So that need to be integrated in adaptation planning. And also agriculture, we need energy support for irrigation and other purposes. So that thing is, so I mean, the policy integration to address resilience building is important, and also our understanding about coping, adaptation, resilience is not very clear. But there are some scholarly papers on that, and said that what we do is just using the varieties and technologies, just coping or at the local level resilience building. But what we want is in the long term, the transformative adaptation. And that needs actually, changes of laws and regimes and systems. But going there is really very difficult. Um, so, and in between this local resilience to transformative adaptation, there are also transitional states, what is explained by Mark Paling, saying that, the transitional thing should be more focused on right-based approach. The community's rights and voices are articulated and accepted and integrated in the policies. And then we need a major change in the policy domain. So going there, maybe we need to do a lot of actions. It's not easy, but I think we are progressing towards that. And thank you.
Tunga, Siddharth, would you like to add to that? Or do we go to the next question?
Okay, just very brief to the question on how you can echo the voice of indigenous people together with any communities or your organization. I think first of all, we can do it with any organization or any work network, but the most important thing is the accountability and the responsiveness of the network or any organization. And secondly, it comes to the legitimacy of the organization or network, because we do that to exchange knowledge and to build the synergy amongst ourselves. So if any actor is very accountable and responsive to the constituencies or to the group, so that they can communicate back and forth and they can be responsible to any of the actors, and they have the legitimacy to represent any group or any section of the community, then that doesn't make difference whoever we go through. But yeah, this is my precise comment. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tunga. With that, let us reflect on the final question of this session, which is in relation to the key asks that you, as your country representative, have working with the communities. That's very important. Have to ask the UNFCCC.
Well, I guess from the international sort of situation here, I guess the first thing that we would like to see is perhaps all the funds that they're talking about here in terms of money. I've been over the years hearing about so many various kinds of funds with all kinds of acronyms, but how far are they actually reaching? To the people that actually require them. I mean, that's something that sort of perhaps always seems to be coming to my mind, at least. The other one, I think, particularly since I work with technologies, I find that the technologies that are available, I mean, particularly the state-of-the-art kind of work that is happening, seems to be locked in a universe altogether, and it doesn't actually reach down. And I think that's something that maybe we really would like to see more, to come more strongly, where we are able to have access to technologies across. So something new comes in, then people, instead of we have sort of a sharing that can happen, and that way, we have better chance to adapt. I suppose that's the idea.
Yeah, I'm just because you spoke on the finance bit of it, I'm reminded of a study that was done by UNEP earlier this year, where the figures on adaptation is close to $100 billion to $340 billion that would be required in developing countries by the year 2030. Now, going from where we are now, which is $300 plus million dollars, is a high jump that needs to be, maybe a triple jump that needs to be made. Now, going by that, there has to be a huge upscaling of adaptation finance, and where is it going to come from is being debated. We don't want to get into that, but then there's a steep jump that needs to be made. The point you're raising, Siddharth, on technology, I was just wondering, when you talk about technology, we essentially, the groups present at the negotiations essentially understand technology from the perspective of being, macro scale, large technologies with IPR issues and all of that. But I just want to clarify from you, when we talk about technologies, aren't we talking about technologies which are really small, which are accessible to the people, which are affordable for them, and which are very, very relevant in their context? And these go beyond. I mean, they don't really require IPR for that matter. So when we're talking about building resilience through technology interventions, where does this IPR fit in there, especially for local level technologies? For me, that's a very redundant question. That's something that I would want you to come back on. With that, can I have you reflect on the asks? Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I believe now this is not time for negotiation. We are not negotiating here now. It's time for the implementation. So I limit myself within the mandate and provision of Paris Agreement, because now it's time for its implementation. So I, as a indigenous community representative, call subsidiary body for implementation to call how the Article 7.5, or how the whole Article 7, which is adaptation, is going to be implemented. We really need the platform for the knowledge exchange that we are saying already. Those communities has a lot of knowledge and experiences. We need the platforms, or we need the mechanisms to exchange those knowledge for the Article 7. And only another point I would like to make is the global stock take that the agreement mentions should not be limited to the overall, I mean, the stock taking of the overall objectives of the agreement, or only the long-term objectives of limiting temperature increase of the global warming. It also should focus on each and every article of the agreement, so that adaptation should not be left out in the process of global stock taking. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunga. Ranga?
I think I don't have anything to say. Many things is covered, but would like to highlight the issue of finance. The finance should be there, of course. In the recent reports coming from various parts have highlighted the inevitable imbalance between the adaptation and mitigation finances. So there's a call for increase the adaptation finance, and the adaptation finance to be grant based and should be at least 50%. I think that's something I need to echo at this point. Thank you.
I think most of the points are covered, but since the Pradeep is sitting here, I guess, and we worked together in developing the first adaptation project in Bangladesh, in the coastal area, afforestation of mangroves, etc. Actually, what we want is, kind of I think the countries experienced the knowledge and capacity of preparing project planning and documents, but I think we are still weak in areas, particularly assessing the adaptation functions. What are the results that, well, this sort of projects funded under this, LDCF and GEF system, what are the lessons that, well, this project is really, these are the adaptation indicators and these are achieved and not achieved and whatever. And this is different from the conventional NRM or other type of projects. So that sort of knowledge and skills, I think that is that sort of thing that we can get from this UNFCCC systems. And funding is well mentioned. And also the what I like to say, the enabling adaptation technologies and information sharing. There are lots of things happenings under this, the GEF and LDCF or other funding windows. But how can this results and knowledge and experience and lessons can be collectivized among different countries? I think these are the important things that we can have the ask to the UNFCCC. Thank you so much.
Since you're talking on finance, I have a question to the speakers. Um, Whether we like it or not, I mean, the corporates are coming in a very big way, given the increasingly, the increasing responsibilities on their shoulders. Now, how do you see that working and going forward? Given what we have seen so far, how do you see them play a role? I don't know whether I should say it a vital role, but how do you see their contribution to this whole adaptation finance landscape? Yeah, Ranga, I see you smiling there.
Well, I'm not totally against private sector. Of course, private sector is needed. And of course, they can play a role in adaptation as well. But in terms of the private sector contribution in adaptation, that needs to be phrased and framed very carefully. Especially the counting the private sector investment in adaptation is very tricky. And I think we don't have the modalities to do that as of now. So we need to be very careful. And in that sense, of course, we need very deep discussions on that as of now. So that is in UNFCCC negotiation process, looking at it in very finance negotiator kind of a position. But as I mentioned, of course, private sector can play a role in adaptation, but in a different way, which for example, mega scale adaptation in the processes, of course, private sector can work. But in terms of community-based local level adaptation, I see a very minimal role for private sector. But on the other hand, what we see is that this is an increasing trend that if you see the overall development discourse, the private sector has a tendency of coming and intruding into the space of government. And over the several years, the civil society plays a kind of acting as a buffer in between, neutralizing that effect. So I think recognizing that neutralizing effect of civil society, there should be a little bit more support to civil society to play that role a little harsher in the future. I'm using the word harsher purposefully because it's still going to be an aggravated fight as I predict. So civil society role is important to, be in between the government and private sector, make sure that the government is not opening up its space too much to the private sector, come and encroach and take control of it, where we don't have any kind of a positive examples around the globe, where that sort of high scaled up private sector intervention helping the communities that we were talking about, the indigenous communities, the marginalized and the vulnerable communities. So the government has a role to play, and the civil society has a role to play as an amplifier of these the communities. And we need to sit right in the middle and take these shocks and absorb it and make sure they are not encroaching into the government space. Thank you.
Just wanted to comment on the limitations and concerns that you raised in relation to corporations not being able or not willingly wanting to support local level adaptation. Maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, because in India, we have something called the CSR, the corporate social responsibility, where about 2% of the net profits is goes for community-based projects for sustainable development. We see that is one space which can be really fruitfully utilized for say social forestry or for strengthening local food production systems, which could address the question of equity, which could address the question of sustainable development. And for us, that is one way by which corporates could meaningful contribute to the whole process of adaptation and therefore resilience building in the long run. I just wanted to flag that point because I thought maybe well, it's speculative, it's all conjectures, but then one can say that that's a space that's available for the corporates in India to support local level adaptation, community based ecosystem adaptation. Can we have questions from the floor? Not that there are many people now, but then can we have questions? We have 2 minutes with us. If they aren't, I would once again like to thank the speakers for the time that they had. And I think this was very vital, going back to what Salim said, that the negotiations talk about, the bigger things, but then the side events like this talk about community voices, and that's very important. That's a very important aspect for spaces like this, international spaces like this. So thank you, audiences. Thank you, speakers. Thank you very much.